Roblox has now given us the ability to ban players from our game, including their alt accounts. So I decided to create a little secret admin GUI, which we can toggle on and off by pressing a secret keybind on our keyboard. And now this GUI will display to us all the players who are currently in our game. And when we click on their name, it'll actually ban them from the game. And just like that, we can see they've now been banned. Then below that, you can see that we have a user ID box, which is where we can actually specify the user ID of another player if we want to ban somebody from our game who's not currently in our server, or maybe they're not currently playing our game. We'd be able to type in their user ID here, hit enter, and then they would be banned from our game. Now, to get started creating this, what we're going to want to do is go down below in the description and look for the link which says Roblox game template. It'll be a link to the Roblox website, and more specifically, a game. Now, this game is completely open source, which means that you can actually download this game and open it up inside of Roblox Studio. We're able to do this by clicking the three dots at the top right-hand corner to the right of the game's name. And once we click those three dots, we should see the option to edit in Studio. And once you click that, Roblox Studio should automatically open up for you, and you should open up right into this game. Now, if for some reason this does not work for you, below the link to this page, I've included another link, which is a direct download of this project file. And once you've downloaded that file, you can click the file button at the top left-hand corner of Roblox Studio, click open from Roblox, and then select the file that you've just downloaded. But again, you would only need to use the direct download if clicking edit in Studio did not work for you. Now, to know that you did open up the correct project, once you get inside of Roblox Studio, you should see a pre-existing GUI, which is a currency display, and you should see some things stored inside of the server script service, the replicated storage, and a couple of other services. Now you might be thinking, I don't want to download a game and start with pre-existing code, but the reason that I'm doing it this way is because the code that we're starting with is some very basic boilerplate code. Basically, this template includes the module framework, which allows us to write all of our logic inside of module scripts. It also comes with a very easy to use UI scaling feature for scaling your UIs to all different device sizes. It also comes with a player data system setup, and it also includes admin commands as well. Now, none of those systems are really relevant to this episode, so you don't have to worry about them. If you do want to learn more about those features though, feel free to check out the video I made covering all of them once you're done watching this video. I'll add it to one of the cards on the end screen, and I'll also leave a link to it down below in the description as well. One more thing that we want to do is make sure that you publish this game. So in the top left-hand corner of the screen, you're going to want to go ahead and click on File. Then you're going to want to click Publish to Roblox, which will prompt you with a screen that looks sort of similar to this. It will be a little bit different, but basically enter in your game name, what platforms you want to publish it on, and you can just go through all of that real quick. Then once you've published the game, you're going to want to go back to the Home tab and click on Game Settings. Because inside of here, we want to go to the Security tab and enable Allow HTTP requests, as well as enable Studio access to API services. These are important to enable, otherwise we would run into some errors once we finish scripting. So now that we've set up the entire project, we're actually ready to begin creating some things. Now, we're going to begin by creating the Ban GUI, which you saw displayed on the screen in the very beginning of the video. Now, one thing that we always want to do before we begin creating GUIs is we're going to want to emulate our screen size to one specific size so that me, you, and all of the other people who are watching this video are creating the GUI at the exact same dimensions. So what you're going to want to do is go over to the Test tab. Inside of here, you're going to see the Emulation section, and you want to click on Device. Then you should see your viewport change a little bit, and towards this top bar right here, you actually have two different options. On the right-hand side, you're going to want to make sure that this is set to Fit to Window. Otherwise, it might be kind of hard to see. Then in the left box, you're going to want to also set this to the desktop section, more specifically HD 1080. And once you've done that, your screen should look pretty similar to mine. So now that we're all creating GUIs at the exact same size, let's go ahead and begin creating the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the Star GUI, and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new Screen GUI. We'll rename the Screen GUI to be called Ban. And then we're going to modify some properties on it. We're first going to set the Ignore GUI inset property to true, because we don't want Roblox's inset to affect the position of this GUI. Then we'll set Reset on Spawn to false, because we never want the GUIs to reset. I always toggle this property off, and those are the only properties that we actually need to modify. Then what we're going to do is go ahead and add a frame to the Screen GUI, and I don't like to change views while we're in the middle of something, but this is kind of a perfect opportunity for me to just disable the output there, and it makes the screen a little bit bigger. There's no point for the output to be there. Let me know in the comments if you like this better. I'll try to remember to do this more often. Anyways, bringing our attention back to the frame, what we're first going to do is position this in the center of the screen. So we want to modify the anchor point and the position property. For the anchor point on both the X and the Y axis, we want to set them to 0.5. Then for the position on both the X and the Y scale, we're going to set those to 0.5 as well. So we'll say 0.5 and 0.5. And now we can see the frame is centered on our screen. The next thing we're going to want to do is resize this. Now, when it comes to setting the size of the main frame, we generally like to use the offset. So in the offset of both the X and the Y axis, I'm going to actually change it from 100 to 600. And now we can see a pretty tall rectangle. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and update the background color of this. And I'm actually going to go ahead and use pick screen color and grab the nice blue from our currency labels, and then I'll hit OK. Now we're pretty much finished with creating this frame, but the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and add in a UI stroke to this. And for the thickness, we're going to go with 5. Then also inside of the frame, we want to go ahead and add in a UI corner to this. The UI corner instance allows us to round the corners of it, and we're going to go ahead and set the corner radius, more specifically the offset, to 22. And now that nicely rounds the edges of the frame. Next, what we're going to want to do is add a frame inside of our existing frame. We're going to rename this frame to be called title. And inside of here, we're going to store a text label, which will practically display the title of this GUI. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is update the size of this. We want to make this a little bit less tall. So on the Y offset, we're going to set that to 75. And we want to make this a little bit longer. So on the X offset, we're going to set that to 350. Now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and adjust the positioning of this. Now, we want to center this horizontally. So on the X axis of the anchor point, we can set that to 0.5. And then for the X of the position scale, we can set that to 0.5 as well. And then we're going to adjust the offset in the Y-axis to about 20, which gives us a nice little bit of spacing between the frame and the edge of the other one. Then let's go ahead and change the background color of this. We're going to use pick screen color once again. I'm actually going to pick the same blue color once again, but then what we're going to do is make this a little bit darker. Now this is the darkness that I'm going to go with, so I'll hit OK. And then what we're going to do is grab the UI corner from inside of our main frame and duplicate that by hitting Control D or right clicking it and then clicking duplicate, and then we'll drag the UI corner inside of the title frame. Now I want to make the corners a little bit more round, so I'm going to change it from 22 to about 30. Then what we're going to do is inside of the title frame, we're going to go ahead and create a text label. We'll rename this text label to be called title. And then for the text of this, we're going to go ahead and say ban. Then for the text color, we're going to change this to white. We'll then set the background transparency to be 1 because we don't want to see the background. Then we're going to go ahead and change the font, and I'm going to go with Verdoka 1 because that's kind of my favorite font to go with. Then we'll go ahead and adjust the sizing of this. First, we'll update the text size. And now you might be used to using automatic size, but do not use the automatic size property anymore. Now that you're watching my videos, you're now going to use a specific text size. Now, we of course want this text to be a little bit larger, so I'm going to increase this quite a bit to about 60. Then what we're going to want to do is center this text in the middle of the title text label. So what we're going to do is go ahead and modify the position. Of course, on the anchor point and the position, we'll set the anchor point to 0.5, 0.5, and then 0.5 for the scale on both of the axes of the position. Now that's looking pretty good, but we want to go ahead and add a UI stroke around this text. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate our pre-existing UI stroke, drag that inside of the text label. And now there is actually one property that we want to change of the UI stroke, and that is the line joined mode. Whenever it comes to text, even though this text doesn't actually look bad, I always prefer to change the line join mode to something other than round. When it's set to round, certain letters, like for instance the B or the A here, sometimes the circle inside of the letter isn't filled in or looks very odd when the line join mode is set to round. That's why I always like to go with these other two choices. Anyways, now that we've done that, we're finished with creating the title text label, and we can collapse the title frame because we're finished with that as well. Next, what we'll do is go ahead and create the exit button. Now, inside of the frame, I'm going to go ahead and create a text button. We'll rename this text button to be called exit. We'll go ahead and start off by updating the background color of this, which I'm going to use this red right here. Then we'll set the text of this text button to be a blank string because we're actually not going to use that text property. Instead, we're going to create a text label inside of here. I like to do that because it makes it a little bit easier to freely position the text, which is something that you do want to do on occasion. Now, before we do that, we're going to want to go ahead and resize this. And in the offset of both the axes, we're going to set that to 65. And now we can see that we have a square. And now what we want to do is position this at the top right-hand corner of our GUI. So let's go ahead and reposition this. First, we'll modify the anchor point, and we're going to set both of them to 0.5. Now, we can kind of see this is centered on the outside of the frame, but it's appearing to the left-hand side. And we of course want this on the right-hand side. So what we're going to do is for the position on the x-axis in scale, we're going to go ahead and put 1 to make it appear on the right-hand side. And now the next thing that we're going to want to do is go ahead and add in a UI stroke and a UI corner to that as well. So we're going to select both of these instances and duplicate them. Then we'll drag and drop them inside of the exit button. First, we'll adjust the UI corner. For the corner radius, we're going to decrease this a little bit. So we're going to go with 18. And then for the UI stroke, we actually don't see the stroke appearing on the button. And the reason for that is because this is a text button and UI strokes have a property called apply stroke mode, which by default is set to contextual. So in the context of being inside of a text button, contextual would make this UI stroke appear around the text of the text button. But if we set this to border, that will make it actually appear around the border of the text button. And now the last thing that we have to do with this exit button is add a text label to it. And we're going to save ourselves some time by actually using the title text label. So let's go ahead and duplicate the title text label, drag that inside of the exit button. We can collapse the title frame. Then we can rename this text label to be called X if we want to. It doesn't really matter. First things first, we're going to go ahead and adjust the text of this to actually say X instead of ban. Then we'll modify the text size to be about 40. And then for the actual size property, what we're going to do is in both the X and the Y scale, we'll go ahead and set it to 1. So now it's just the entire height and width of the exit button. And with that being said, we can now see the exit button's looking pretty nice, so we can go ahead and collapse that. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do is create sort of a container frame, which is going to hold text buttons inside of it that will display the name of the players that are in our game that we're able to actually ban. So inside of the frame, we want to go ahead and create a scrolling frame, which effectively a scrolling frame is pretty much what a normal frame is, but you can actually scroll inside of it. And we definitely want scrolling to be possible because we don't really have a fixed amount of names. So if there's a lot of players in our game, we might want to be able to scroll through a bunch of different names. Now, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and resize the scrolling frame. On the X scale, we're going to set that to 0.95. And on the Y offset, we're going to go ahead and set that to 380. Then we're going to want to go ahead and center this both horizontally and vertically. So for the anchor point, we're going to go with 0.5 on both of those. And then for the scale of both position axes, we're going to go with 0.5 as well. Now, the size of it's looking pretty good. The positioning is looking pretty good as well. What we're then going to do is go ahead and set the background transparency property from 0 to 1 so that we don't see the background. Then for the scroll bar thickness, I'm going to decrease this a little bit, so I'm going to go with about 8. Then we want to go ahead and update the canvas size property because in the scale of the y-axis, this is set to 2, but we're going to change this from 2 to 0. The reason that we're doing that is because if we have a couple of text buttons inside of the scrolling frame, but let's say not enough text buttons that we actually need to begin scrolling, we don't need to display the scroll bar then. But now, once we actually have enough buttons inside of the scrolling frame that we are able to scroll down, that scroll bar will reappear. And we'll see that in a couple of minutes. And I actually almost forgot, but we're also going to rename the scrolling frame to be called container. And there's actually one additional property that we need to change on here as well, which is the automatic canvas size property. And we want to change that from none to Y. And when we set this to Y, the scroll bar inside of our scrolling frame will only be displayed when there are enough children inside of the scrolling frame that the user can actually begin scrolling. Now that might sound confusing. Essentially, this just makes it look a little bit nicer. And as we go through this, you'll see actually why we do this. Then we're actually going to duplicate the exit button and drag that inside of the container. We're simply doing that because the exit button is sort of a pre-made button, so it saves us a little bit of time when we're working on our new button. Now, also inside of the container, we're going to want to go ahead and add in an instance called UI Grid Layout. Now, the UI Grid Layout effectively allows us to simply lay out a bunch of items where we can specify the size of them and the padding, which would be the spacing between them. So for instance, with the cell size, this will actually modify the size property of the text button. If we actually try to modify the size property of the text button, we're not able to, and we can see a red triangle here because the UI Grid Layout instance actually overrides the size property of all the children that's stored inside of this container right beside the UI Grid Layout. So for the cell size, we're going to set the X offset to 0, but on the X scale, we're going to go ahead and set that to 0.9 because we want it to be almost the entire width of the container frame. And then on the Y offset, we're going to go ahead and set that to 65. Then we can go ahead and duplicate this button a couple of times because now what we're going to do is take a look at the cell padding. Now, because of how our items are laid out, the x-axis of the cell padding doesn't matter because there will not be any horizontal padding. There would be horizontal padding if these were lined up beside each other, but instead we want to adjust the y-axis of the cell padding, which would be the vertical padding, and we're going to increase that from 5 to about 15. And now we can actually see a space in between all of our buttons. Next, what we're going to do is come down to the behavior section, and the behavior that we want to change is actually the sort order. Instead of sorting by the layout order, which is a property of each of the text buttons, like we can can literally look and see there's a literal property on the text button called layout order. Instead of sorting them by the layout order, we want to go ahead and sort them by their name. So we'll actually sort them alphabetically. Then we want to come down to the alignment section, and for the horizontal alignment, we're going to set that to center. But for the vertical alignment, we'll actually leave that at top. Now, one thing that I forgot to show off is that when we actually have enough buttons, we can see that the scroll bar does appear. Now, you should be able to notice with the furthest button, sort of the bottom portion of it is cut off a little bit. And if we look at the first button, we can see the top portion of this one is cut off as well. Now, we can actually solve this issue by adding in a UI padding instance to inside of the container. And then we want to actually adjust the padding bottom and the padding top. By adjusting these, it'll allow us to create some spacing between the top of the container and the bottom of the container to prevent the parts of the buttons from being cut off. So for the padding top, for the offset, we're going to go ahead and set that to 5 so that there's 5 pixels between the edge of the container and the beginning of where the buttons start. And then if we scroll down, we can go ahead and adjust the offset of the padding bottom to 5 as well. And now when we scroll all the way down, we can see the entire button and it's no longer being cut off. And if we scroll all the way up, we can also see the buttons not getting cut off up here either. So that is all looking perfect. So now that we've set up the UI grid layout, most of the container, the UI padding, let's actually get around to setting up our text button. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all of them except for one and then delete them. Then with the remaining one, we're going to go ahead and rename this to be called template, because effectively this button is going to be used as a template because we're going to duplicate it every single time we want to create a brand new button to display a new player. Now, to begin working with this template, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and start off by modifying the background color. Now, I'm going to use the same color as the background for our title frame, although I actually might make it just a little bit of a lighter shade. Then inside of the template text button, we of course have our text label, which is named X. We want to rename this text label to be called player, as the text of this text label is going to be the player's name. So I'll go ahead and update the text of this as well to just be an example of what this will look like when it's being displayed. So I'll type out my own username. Then we're actually going to decrease the text size a little bit, and we're going to go with 38. And then for the UI stroke, we might adjust this a tiny bit as well and decrease the thickness a tiny bit. So we'll go from a 5 down to a 4. But now that we've done that, we're pretty much finished with actually creating the template. If we wanted to, we can duplicate this a couple of times to sort of see how it appears when multiple buttons are being displayed. And then we can scroll down a little bit, see what it looks like, and that is all looking very good. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all the templates except for this one. Then I'm actually going to set the visibility property of this to false so that we no longer see this. Now we're also finished with the container, so we can go ahead and collapse that. But now there's one final thing that we want to do, and that is creating the text box for entering in a user ID of the person that we want to ban. Now, to start this off, we're actually going to want to go ahead and duplicate the title frame. We'll go ahead and rename this to be called input, and then we're going to adjust the y-axis of the size a tiny bit, and we're just going to go from 75 down to 65. Now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and reposition this, and of course we want to reposition this towards the bottom of our GUI. So for the anchor point on the y-axis, we're going to set that to 1, and then for the position, for the scale of the y-axis, we'll set that to 1 as well. And then we'll adjust the Y offset, and we'll go with about -20. Now actually, just to kind of make this a little bit easier to see, maybe I'll just adjust the background transparency of the container for right now. And we can see that there is a decent amount of spacing in between these two. Maybe we want to decrease the spacing a tiny bit though. So for the position, we'll actually set this to -25 to make it a little bit closer. And now that we like the positioning of that, I'm going to go ahead and reset the background transparency of the container back to 1. Then going back to the input frame, what we're first going to want to do is adjust the UI corner. And we're actually going to decrease this a little bit. So instead of going with 30, we're going to go with 10. Then we'll also actually add in a UI stroke to this as well. So let's go ahead and duplicate that one and drag it down here. And we're going to go ahead and decrease the thickness of this a little bit. And we're going to go with about 3. Then we're actually going to go ahead and delete the title text label because we're going to replace this with a text box. Now, with the text box, for the size, we're going to make this the entire height and width of the frame. So we'll go ahead and say 1 in both the scale portions. Then we can go ahead and set the background transparency to 1. Let's go ahead and adjust the font, of course, to being Fredoka 1. Then we'll go ahead and adjust the text size. And for the text size, we're going to go with about 38. Then for the text color, we want to make that white. And then we're going to want to go ahead and duplicate the UI stroke from inside of the input and drag that inside of the text box. Then I'm going to go ahead and update the text property of the text box to be completely blank. And then I'm going to go ahead and update the placeholder text property to actually say user ID ... to indicate to the player that this is where you'll type out the user ID. And then I'll also change the placeholder color, and instead of being gray, I'm going to go ahead and make that a white. And now that we've done all of that, we're actually fully finished with creating this GUI. Well, like 99.9% done. We're actually done with creating the visual side of things, but because of how our UI scaling system actually works, we need to add in a UI scale instance to this GUI. Then in the properties of the UI scale, we want to add in a brand new tag. So we'll click the plus button next to tags, and the tag that we want to add in is called scale_component. So you can type that here, or if you do have that suggested to you, I would just click the suggestion. But now in addition to the tags, we also want to add one attribute to this, which would actually be a vector 2, and it's going to be called base_resolution. Then we'll go ahead and hit save. And now for the base resolution, this is actually the resolution that we created this GUI in. So we emulated our resolution to 1920 by 1080. So what I would say is 1920, 1080, just like that. And if you had any difficulties with that, you could also just duplicate the UI scale inside of the right screen GUI and just drag that inside of here, and that would work perfectly fine as well. Anyways, now that we've created the UI scale, we are fully finished with creating this GUI. The last thing that we're going to do is set the enabled property of the Ban Screen Gui to false so that we no longer see it. And now we're actually ready to get started with scripting. So to begin scripting, we're going to start off by working on the server side. Now, ultimately, there isn't a whole lot that we actually have to do on the server side, but what we do need to do is we need to actually create a remote event, which we'll use to communicate from the client over to the server whenever we want to ban a player. So the client will communicate to the server and tell the server what specific player we would like to ban. And then on the server side, we need to write all the logic for actually banning that player from the game. So in order to get started with this, like I said, we want to start off by creating a remote event. So we're actually going to do this inside of the replicated storage and inside of the folder called remotes. Now inside of here, we're going to go ahead and add in a brand new remote event, which we'll rename to be called ban. And now that we've created that remote event, we can go ahead and collapse the replicated storage because we're finished with inside of there. And now we want to head over to the server script service. Inside of the server script service, we have a folder called services. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script. Now we'll rename this module script to be called ban service. And now inside of this module script, I'm going to rename the module variable to be called shared, and then I'll update the return statement as well. Now, towards the very top of this module script, we're going to want to create a few variables for some different services. The first service that we want to create a variable for is actually the players service. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called players, and then we'll say game::get service, and then we'll get the players service. Then the second service that we want to get is actually called replicated storage. So we'll also make a variable for that one as well. And now that we've created a variable for the replicated storage, we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the remotes folder that's stored inside of there. So we'll create a variable called remotes, and we'll set this to the folder that's called remotes inside of the replicated storage. And now we're going to create another variable, which is actually going to be a constant variable. Constant variables are variables which do not change, and their name is written in all capital letters. Generally, the reason that you create constant variables is because these variables stand out and are usually meant to be easily configurable. So we can look towards the beginning of our script, see the constant variables that stand out, make any changes that we want to that system, rather than having to go through our entire module script, look at different functions, and then change numbers or variables that way. So we're going to go ahead and create this variable. We'll go ahead and say local, and the name of this variable is going to be called admin_IDs. And this is going to be equal to a table. Now this table is actually going to be an array, and this array is going to hold the user IDs of every single player which we're considering as an admin. So these players will be the only players who are actually able to ban other players from our game. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my user ID right inside of here. And if you want to add more IDs, you can by just using a comma and then including their ID inside of here as well. Now, of course, I don't need to use these other two IDs, so I'm going to go ahead and remove them. But feel free to add all of your other admin IDs inside of here, and also make sure to remove the IDs from here as well if you remove any of the admins from your game. Then the next thing we're going to do is in between the shared variable and the return statement, we're going to go ahead and create a function which is going to be a part of the shared table, and this function is going to be called ban player. Now, this function is going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the player, which is trying to ban another player, and that's going to, of course, be of the player object. And then the second parameter is actually going to be the player ID of the player that we would like to ban. And now this player ID is actually going to be a string. So this function is going to be used whenever that remote event is fired off that we created earlier. So anytime the client side is communicating to the server, hey, we want to ban a player, what we'll do is on the client side, we'll actually pass through the player ID of the player that we actually want to ban. So once we get this sort of notification on the server side, hey, a client wants to ban somebody, what do we want to do? Well, the first thing that we want to do is we want to check if the player who is trying to ban another player is even able to ban them. So we're going to create a variable called isAdmin. And to determine if a player is an admin or not, we want to look through the admin IDs table for that player's user ID. Now we can do this by using a function on the table library called find. So we'll say table.find. And now first we need to pass through the table that we want to look through. So we want to search through the admin IDs table. And what we're actually looking for is the user ID of our player. And now if this player is not an admin, then what we're going to do is say return in order to stop the function right there. Because if a non-admin is trying to ban a player in our game, then we can literally just completely ignore them. Now that we know that this player is actually able to ban the other player, we need to create the ban config. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called config, and we'll specify the type of this to be ban config type, which is a table. Now we're going to include 3 different properties inside of this table. The first property that we're going to include is called user IDs, which accepts an array of user IDs. So we'll go ahead and create a table, and then we'll pass through the player ID, which would be the ID of the player that we would like to ban. Then we'll specify the duration, which would be in seconds. So if we said 10, that would be 10 seconds. If we said 60, that would be 1 minute, and we can make the ban even longer. Additionally, if we wanted to make this ban permanent, we could even say -1, and that would permanently ban the player from our game. And the only way for them to become unbanned would be for us to use the unban method. Now, I'm going to make the ban permanent, so I'll leave this at -1. And now the final property that we're going to include is called display reason. And this property is a string which will be displayed to the player once they've been banned and each time they try to rejoin our game. So the message that I'm going to display to the player is, "You have broke our rules!" And now that we've created that ban config, we can actually use that to ban the player. Now, whenever we want to use the ban method, this method actually invokes an HTTP call, which might sound confusing, but the main thing that we need to know about that is that means that this function can actually fail. So we would like to wrap that inside of a P call. Now, if you're unfamiliar with a P call, basically a P call is a function which we could use and pass another function to inside of it, and any logic or functions that we use inside of a P call, if that function breaks or an error occurs inside of it, the P call will catch that error and basically prevent all of the code from breaking after that. So to use a P call, we're going to create a variable. And now this variable is actually going to be sort of 2 variables. So the first variable's name is going to be called success. Then we'll use a comma, and the second one is going to be called error. Then we'll say equals, and now we'll go ahead and create a P call. So we'll say P call, and now inside of this function called P call, we want to go ahead and create an anonymous function inside of here. And now this function inside of this P call, what we actually want to do is return something, and what we want to return is actually us using the ban method. Now, to ban a player from our game, we actually use a method on the player service, and this method is called ban async. Now, with this method, we need to just pass through the config, which we created earlier. So we'll go ahead and do that. And now that we've done that, we are actually banning the player whenever this function is called. So now that we finished creating this function, let's go ahead and use it. And remember, when did I say that we were going to use this? Well, we're going to use this anytime the ban remote event is fired off from the client side. Now, because we are using the module framework, rather than connecting the remote event at the very bottom of the script, what we're going to do is actually create a brand new function. And this function is going to be a part of the shared table, and it's going to be called onStart. If you're unfamiliar with the module framework that we're using, basically, if we create a function called onStart and we include that inside of the shared table, all the logic and code that we include inside of this function will be ran when this module is required when the game starts up. So it's basically just a much nicer way of organizing your code inside of a function towards the very top, rather than writing it all at the very bottom like you would in a normal script. Anyways, next what we're going to do is go ahead and hook up that remote event to this function. So we'll go ahead and say remotes.ban.onServerEvent::connect, and then we'll go ahead and connect it to the shared.ban player function, just like that. And with that being said, we're fully finished with writing everything on the server side, so we can go ahead and close out of that, and close out of that module script, and then collapse the server script service. And now let's begin scripting this on the client side. So to do this, we'll go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, and inside of the controllers folder. Now, the first thing we want to do is actually update the GUI controller module. The reason for this is because inside of this module, we actually have a table called GUIs. And inside of this table is where we store a variable or a reference to each of the screen GUIs that we've created and stored inside of the starter GUI. So for instance, we can see the right variable already inside of here, which has been created for the right screen GUI. Now, one of the main reasons that we use the GUI controller is because it simply saves us a couple of lines of code that we're not having to rewrite every single time we want to create a script for a GUI. So essentially, it allows us to avoid creating the player's variable, the player variable, the player GUI variable, and then also creating the variable for the screen GUI as well. Anyways, let's go ahead and update the GUI's variable, and we'll go ahead and add the ban GUI to here. So we'll go ahead and say ban, and then we'll set that equal to the player GUI, and then we want to wait for a child inside of the player GUI, and the child that we want to wait for is called ban. Cool. So now that we've updated that and added the ban GUI to the GUI's table, we can actually use and access this in other scripts. So let's go ahead and close out of this module script. Then inside of the GUIs folder, let's go ahead and create a brand new module script. We'll go ahead and rename this module script to be called Ban. And then I'm going to rename the module variable to, of course, be called shared. And then above the shared variable, I'm actually going to create another variable, which is going to be equal to a table. And this variable is going to be called local. Now, like I said, if you're ever wanting more context on the reason that we're doing specific things, I recommend that you watch the video that I linked down below in the description, or I'll have on the end screen, where we sort of go over the module framework, some of the libraries that are included in this project, and other things like that. But basically, the reason that we create this local variable is because any of the functions that we create inside of here, we can easily organize them by putting certain functions inside of the local table, and the functions that are a part of the local table are essentially meant to not be used by other module scripts, whereas any functions that we attach to the shared table can actually be used by other module scripts which require this one. So essentially, it's just my preferred method of organization. Anyway, towards the very top of the script, we're going to want to go ahead and create some variables for a few different services. The first variable that we're going to create is called players, which of course is going to be for the players service. Then after that service, we want to go ahead and create a variable for the replicated storage. And in addition to the replicated storage, we also want to create a variable for the user input service. Now that we've gotten all of those services, we want to create a couple of more variables. The first variable that we want to create is a variable for the GUI controller that we just updated not too long ago. Now, to get the GUI controller, that is a module script, so of course we're going to want to require it. And then to get to it, what we would say is script.parent, which will take us to the GUIs folder, and then we'll say .parent once again, which will take us to the controllers folder. And then of course from the controllers folder, we can directly access the GUI controller. And then after the GUI controller variable, we also want to create a variable called remotes, which of course is for that remotes folder inside of the replicated storage. Now that we've created all of those variables, we want to start creating some variables for different components of our GUI. So the first variable that we're going to create is going to be called GUI, which we want to set to the actual screen GUI. So we're going to say GUI controllers.GUIs, and then we're going to say .ban, which will give us that Ban Screen GUI. Then we're going to go ahead and create a variable called frame, which will set to GUI.frame. And now that we've gotten the frame, let's go ahead and create a variable for the container inside of there. So we'll say frame.container. In addition to the container, we also want to create a variable for the text box, which is inside of the frame, inside of another frame called input. And then, of course, inside of there is where we have the text box stored. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called exit, which is for the exit button. And the exit button is a button called exit stored inside of the frame. Now, there's one last variable that we want to create. This is another constant variable. So, of course, it's going to be written in all capital letters. And this variable is going to be called display_keys. And it's going to be equal to a table, which is going to be an array of keys that we would like to be able to press in order to display or hide the Ban GUI. Now, the way that we're going to write these keys is by actually using an enum. So we're going to say enum.keycode. And then once we write a period, we can see all of the different keys that are actually suggested to us. So the keys that I'm going to go with are something like F2. And then I'll also include another key. So we'll say enum.keycode, and then I'll say F3. So we'll be able to use F2 and F3 to hide or display the GUI. But of course, you can feel free to use whichever ones you'd like. Now that we've created all those variables, we can actually get started with writing some of the logic. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and create our standard onStart function. So we'll say function shared.onStart. And now inside of this function, the first thing that we want to do is actually write the logic for displaying and opening up the GUI. And of course, we want to display the GUI when a player presses those specific key codes. So the way that we can determine when a player has actually pressed the key code is by using the user input service, because this service gives us an event called input ended, which we can connect to, and then we can create an anonymous function inside of here, which will give us the input and a second parameter, which is called game processed event. Game processed event essentially tells us if this input was canceled out or already kind of consumed by Roblox. So the first thing we're going to do is say if game processed event, then we'll return in order to stop the function right there. Because if Roblox already handled this or something else already handled this event, then we could just let them handle it and we don't need to open up the GUI or anything. But now after that, if this input has not already been handled by something else, what we're going to do is check if it is one of our display keys. So we'll create a variable called isDisplayKey. And to determine if the input was a display key, what we would do is use the table.find function. We'll look inside of the display keys table for input.keycode. So we'll look for if that specific key code that was given to us is one of the display keys. Now, if it is a display key, then what we actually want to do is toggle the GUI to be displayed or not displayed. And we can easily do this by saying GUI.enabled equals not GUI.disabled. enabled. So now, whenever these keybinds are used, as long as something else is not processing the event, then the GUI will be displayed or hidden from the player. And you should be able to hop into your game and test this out by literally starting up your game and using any of the keys that you put inside of here. If you're unable to toggle the GUI to become visible and then invisible, then you probably messed something up. And now we're done with writing logic inside of the input ended event. The next thing that we're going to do is actually write the logic for the exit button to close the GUI whenever it's clicked. And to do this, what we would say is exit.mouseButton1 click :connect, and then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And now whenever the exit button is clicked, we're of course going to want to hide the GUI. So we would say GUI.enabled equals false. And again, you're already able to test this out. So you can start up your game, and if you click the exit button, it should make your GUI disappear. Now, we're actually going to go back outside of the onStart function and begin creating some other functions. So the first function that we're going to create is going to be part of the local table, and this function is going to be called createBanButton. Now, this function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be the player that we would like to create the ban button for. Now, the first thing we want to do inside of this function is actually determine if the player that was passed to this function is this client themselves. So we'll create a variable called isLocalPlayer. And to determine if it is the local player or not, we would check if that player that's passed to this function equals the players.localPlayer. And I accidentally used 3 equal signs instead of 2, but there we go. And now if it is the local player, then we would not want to create a ban button for ourselves, so we would say return to stop the function right there. But now that we know that we're not creating a button for ourselves, let's go ahead and actually create a brand new button. So we'll go ahead and create a variable inside of here called button, and what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the container and we're going to get the template. Once we get the template, we're going to go ahead and clone it. And now that we've cloned it, what we need to do is first update the visible property, because by default, this is set to false, and instead we need to set that to true so that it is being displayed. Then we also need to set the parent property of this equal to the container, because when you clone something, the parent is actually set to nil. So we need to set it back to the container essentially. Then inside of the button, we have a text label called player. So we want to set the text of that text button to the name of the player. And then we also want to rename the button as well, and we're going to set that to the user ID of the player. Now, there's one final thing that we need to do with this button, and that's actually listening for it to be clicked on. So we'll say mouseButton1 click. We'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function. And now whenever a player's ban button is clicked on, what we want to do is communicate from the client side over to the server side to say, hey, we want to ban this player. So to do this, we of course want to use that remote event that we created earlier called ban, and we would use a method of that remote event called fireServer. But now we need to communicate something to the server, and that's the specific player that we would like to ban. So we'll go ahead and pass through the user ID of that player. Cool. So now we've actually written all the logic that we need to for creating a ban button for every player. But now we need to think a little bit further ahead, because another thing that we need to do is actually remove these ban buttons for players whenever they leave the game as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a brand new function, which again is going to be part of the local table, and this one's going to be called removeBanButton. And again, it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be a player. Now, this function's a lot more simple. What we need to do is try to find the specific button. So we're going to create a variable called button. And now to find the button, we would look inside of the container. To look inside of the container, we would use a method called findFirstChild. And what we would actually look for is a button named player.userID. Because remember, we renamed the ban button when we create it to the player's user ID. Then, if we are able to find the button, what we're going to do is simply remove it. And to remove it, we would go ahead and call the destroy method on it. And that's how we're able to remove a player's ban button. Now that we've created both of those functions, let's go ahead and actually use them. And we're going to use them inside of the onStart function. Now, normally, we would only want to create ban buttons whenever a player joins our game. But whenever a player joins another game, there's a chance that other players are already inside of that game. And if there are players inside of that game, then of course we would like to create ban buttons for those players as well. So what we would like to do is iterate through all the players who are currently in the game. And to do this, we of course are going to use a for loop. We're going to say for_player in players get players do. And then as we iterate through every single player currently in the game, we're going to go ahead and call the create ban button function, passing through the player. So that'll create a ban button for every single player that's currently in our game. But then of course we need to hook this function up so that every time a player joins our game, a button will also be created for them as well. And the way that we can do that is by using the player service. We'll listen to the player added event, and then we'll go ahead and connect that event to the local.createBanButton function. In addition to the create ban button, we also created a second function, which was the remove ban button. And when will we want to use that function? Well, of course, we would want to use that function whenever a player has left our game. And we can listen for when a player leaves our game by using the player service, because it gives us the player removing event, which we can simply just go ahead and connect to the remove ban button function. So with all this code, we've now written all of the logic for handling the entire ban button system. The only other thing left for us to do is actually write the logic for the text box whenever we want to specify a specific user ID to ban from our game as well. So to get started with that logic, what we're going to do is towards the very bottom of our module script, we're going to create another function, which is going to be a part of the local table. And this function is going to be called setupInput. And it's not going to have any parameters. Now, inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to basically connect to an event on the text box, which is fired off when the player is done typing inside of there. So to do this, we're going to say text box, and there's going to be an event on the text box, which is called focus lost, which of course we're going to want to connect to, and then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here, which is going to have two parameters, but we really only care about the first one, which is called enter pressed, and that is a boolean. Now, enter pressed literally just lets us know if the player has pressed the enter key or not. And usually when I'm setting up the logic for my text box, the way that I like for it to work is that for your text account, what you need to do is type the text inside of the text box and then hit the enter key. It's essentially like sending a chat message. If you type text into the chat box in Roblox and then click outside of that box, Roblox is not going to send a message for you. They're only going to send a message for you if you hit enter. So that's sort of how I treat my text box as well. So the first thing we want to do is actually check if the enter key was pressed for the focus to be lost on the text box. So we'll say if not enter pressed, then return end to stop the function right there. But now, as long as the enter key was pressed, what we're going to do is create a variable for the user ID. And to get the user ID, what we would do is say toNumber, and then we'll say textbox.text. So we're trying to convert the text, which is inside of the text box that the player has actually put there, into a number. And then we'll say if not user ID, then return end to stop the function right there as well. And we're doing that because if somebody includes a letter inside of here, or maybe a space or different things like that, which would prevent this string from being turned into a number, then we know that that's not a valid user ID, so we don't even need to communicate that to the server. But now that we know that it could even possibly be a user ID, we know that we can go ahead and communicate this with the server side. So to do this, we'll go ahead and use that remote event, the ban remote event that we created earlier. We'll go ahead and say fire server, and then we'll pass through the user ID variable that we created. And now that we've created this function, the only thing that we actually have to do is go ahead and call it. And where are we going to call it? Well, of course, we're going to call it inside of the onStart function, and we'll just add it at the very last line. So we'll say local.setupInput, just like that. And with all that being said, we're fully finished with scripting out this entire system. So we can go ahead, close out of this and close out of that module, collapse the starter player. I'm going to toggle my output back on so that I can actually see if there's any errors. Now, of course, if you just load into your game, you won't actually see any buns being created because you would be the only player in your game. But there is an easy way for us to actually test this out. What we're going to want to do is go to the test tab, and inside of the test tab, we have the clients and servers section. Inside of here, you should see a little toggle which says a number and then players. Click that, and then you want to make sure that you have at least 2 players. Then you can go ahead and click the start button, which will essentially launch you into a Roblox game with multiple players. Well, really the amount of players that you specified here. If you click play or play here, for example, though, that'll just bring you to your normal testing environment, which would just be with yourself. So you want to make sure that you click the start button. Okay, so now I'm in the game, and we can see there are 2 players in this game. The account that I'm currently on is called player 1, but we also have player 2. If I'm going to go ahead and try to toggle on and off the GUI, so I'll use my hotkey. We can see that when I'm using my hotkey, it is working perfectly. The exit button works perfectly as well. And the only ban button that we can see is for player 2, so we can see that that is working correctly as well. Now, we're not actually able to test banning inside of Roblox Studio because the ban methods do not even function at all inside of Studio. And then also when I'm testing this, I'm on a different account than my main one, basically. So like player 1, for example, the user ID here is -1, which of course is not a user ID that I included in our admins table in the ban server script that we created on the server side. So testing is kind of limited here. But if you wanted to really test it out, you could actually include -1 as one of the admin IDs, or you could feel free to just publish this game, join the game, and then try to get one of your friends to join, or maybe join it on a second account as well, and then test banning out that way. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below, letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit monster.dev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.